You have to picture the scene. It's Christmas Eve, 1866, inside Old Bedlam, the officers' quarters at Fort Laramie. A full-dress ball is underway. The fiddles are scraping out a tune, the air is warm with laughter and candlelight, and for a few hours the officers and their wives can forget they're posted at the edge of the world. Then, without warning, the ballroom doors burst open. The wind and the snow howl into the room, and standing in the doorway is a figure that barely looks human. It's a ghost made of ice and desperation, his face a frozen mask, his buffalo coat a solid sheet of white. The music dies. Every eye turns as the man stumbles forward, collapses at the feet of the post commander, and with a voice like cracking ice, delivers a message of absolute annihilation from a besieged fort 236 miles away. This spectre had a name, John Phillips, known to most as Portugee. He was a civilian, an outsider. And the question that hung in the air that night, long after he was carried away, is the same one we ask today. What kind of man rides into a blizzard that would freeze the devil himself through territory swarming with victorious warriors when every soldier in the fort refused the task? Was he a hero, a fool, or something else entirely? Today, we're going to trace the path of the man behind the legend and try to understand what drove him to undertake one of the most brutal, desperate rides in American history. The man who stumbled into that Christmas ball wasn't born in the misty hollows of Kentucky or the deep woods of Tennessee. His story starts a world away on the island of Terceira in the Azores, a cluster of volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He was born Manuel Felipe Cardoso, and the salt of the sea was in his blood long before the dust of the plains. Like so many others from the old world, he heard the siren song of America, the promise of gold glittering in the streams of California. So, as a young man, he left behind the only life he'd ever known and made the long journey across the water, chasing a dream. But the dream was a harsh master. The gold fields were a brutal lottery, and for every man who struck it rich, 1,000 more broke their backs for nothing. He was an outsider, a foreigner with a thick accent, surrounded by men who were quick to judge and quicker to violence. To survive, he shed his old name like a snake sheds its skin, becoming John Phillips. But he could never shed his origins. The nickname they gave him, Portugee, stuck to him like a burr. It was a brand, a constant reminder that he wasn't one of them, that he would always be on the outside looking in. From the gold fields, he drifted. He moved through the mining camps and raw frontier towns of the West, taking whatever work he could find. This wasn't a life of adventure. It was a life of grinding labor, of calloused hands and empty pockets. He learned to be quiet, to watch, and to listen. He learned to read a man's intentions in his eyes faster than a preacher could read a Bible verse. He learned to read the turn of the weather in the clouds and the promise of danger in the rustle of a dry leaf. The frontier became his forge, and it hammered him into something hard, something resilient, something that did not break. And in this way, his soul became Appalachian, even if his blood was not. The people who settled those mountains knew what it was to leave a home behind. They knew the sting of prejudice and the gnawing loneliness of a strange land. They learned, out of necessity, a fierce and uncompromising self-reliance, because when trouble came, you couldn't count on anyone but yourself and your kin. John Phillips had no kin in this new world, so he learned to rely on himself with an intensity that few men could understand. The code he lived by wasn't written in any law book. It was a simple, brutal creed forged in hardship. You do the job you're hired for. You look a man in the eye. You don't make promises you can't keep, and you endure. You endure the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, the contempt of others. You put your head down, you do the work, and you survive. This was the man, the quiet outsider, who found himself chopping wood for the US Army in the winter of 1866, in the most dangerous place on earth. Before the blood stained the snow, life at Fort Phil Kearny had a grim, grinding rhythm. It wasn't a life of glory. It was a life of survival, measured in cords of wood and barrels of water. Every day, the gates of the stockade would swing open, and the wood trains would creak out into the hills, every man with his rifle laid across his lap, his eyes scanning the ridges. The air was thin and sharp, and the silence of the surrounding wilderness was a heavy, watchful thing. This was the world John Phillips inhabited, not as a soldier fighting for a flag, but as a civilian fighting for a wage. You see, John Phillips wasn't a soldier. He hadn't sworn an oath or donned a blue uniform. He was a contractor, a man who had hired on to cut timber and scout the trails because it was a paying job in a land that didn't offer many. To the officers, he was just another rough-handed civilian. But to the other men who worked the wood details, the ones who faced the same daily threat, he was something more. He was steady. In a place buzzing with the nervous energy of green recruits and the loud boasts of arrogant officers, Phillips was a quiet center of gravity. He didn't waste words. While other men would complain about the cold or the commanders, Phillips would be checking the cinch on his saddle or sharpening his axe. He had the kind of competence that doesn't need to announce itself. He could read a track in the snow that a dozen soldiers would miss, and he understood the unforgiving calculus of the wilderness. He knew that nature and the Lakota warriors who ruled this land were patient, and they punished foolishness with a swift and terrible finality. His world was a simple one. It consisted of his bunk, the mess hall, the biting wind on his face, and the satisfaction of a day's hard labor done without incident. He had built a small, precarious life for himself within the walls of that fort. It wasn't much, just a job and the respect of the few men who knew his worth. But for a man who had started with nothing, an immigrant in a foreign land, this small foothold was everything. It was his piece of the world, bought and paid for with sweat and vigilance. And it was this world, this fragile existence, that was about to be shattered. But every man, no matter how tough, has a crack in his armor. And for John Phillips, his fatal flaw wasn't a weakness, but a strength pushed to a self-destructive extreme. It was his word. In the shifting, treacherous world of the frontier, full of fast talkers and con men, Phillips was a man of absolute, unshakable integrity. If he gave you his word that a job would be done, the sky could fall and the rivers could run backward, but that job would get done. His word wasn't a contract on paper, it was a promise carved into his own soul. There were stories about it, told quietly by the men who worked beside him. They talked of a time he'd agreed to haul a load of supplies to a remote mining camp. A sudden flash flood washed out the only safe trail, turning a 2-day trip into an impossible journey. Any other man would have turned back, and no one would have blamed him. But not Phillips. He spent the better part of a week navigating treacherous ridges and canyons, risking his life and his mules to get that wagon through. When he finally arrived, half-starved and exhausted, he refused any extra pay. He had given his word for a set price. The matter was closed. This wasn't just stubbornness, it was the very core of his identity. As an immigrant, as Portugee, he knew he was judged by a different standard. He had no family name to lean on, no long history in this country. All he had was his reputation, his ability to endure, to be reliable, to be a man whose word was as solid as the mountains themselves. That was his shield. It was his way of proving to the world and to himself that he was the equal of any man there. To break a promise would be more than a failure. It would be a confession that he was the outsider, the lesser man they all thought he was. And this is the tragedy of John Phillips. This simple, stubborn code of honor was the best part of him, but it was also the crack in his armor. It meant that when a situation arose that was so desperate, so impossible that reason and self-preservation screamed to stay put, he wouldn't be able to. His pride, his very sense of self, was tied up in being the man who did what others could not. He was a perfect instrument for a desperate commander, but a terrible guardian of his own life, because his code left no room for backing down. The 21st of December, 1866, dawned brittle and clear, the kind of cold that freezes a man's breath in his lungs. The spark fell just before noon. A frantic message arrived from the wood train. They were under attack. Inside the fort, the alarm bells shattered the quiet. A relief party was scrambled, and the command fell to Captain William J. Fetterman. Fetterman was a man consumed by a dangerous cocktail of bravery and arrogance. He held his commander, Colonel Carrington, in open contempt for his caution, and had once famously boasted, "Give me 80 men, and I will ride through the whole Sioux nation." Carrington, sensing the man's recklessness, gave him his 80 men with a direct and explicit order. It was an order spoken with the weight of a premonition. Relieve the wood train, but under no circumstances pursue the enemy over Lodge Trail Ridge. Fetterman acknowledged the command, but his eyes held a feverish glint. To him, this wasn't a rescue mission. It was a chance to prove his own courage and expose his commander's cowardice. It was a chance for glory. The tribes, under the brilliant leadership of Red Cloud and a young warrior named Crazy Horse, had prepared for just such a man. They had laid a trap of breathtaking simplicity and cunning. A small band of decoys, including Crazy Horse himself, feigned a panicked retreat, taunting the soldiers, drawing them further and further from the fort. They led Fetterman right to the base of Lodge Trail Ridge, the forbidden line. For a moment he must have hesitated, Carrington's words echoing in his mind. But the sight of the fleeing warriors was too much for his pride to bear. He spurred his horse forward, leading his entire command over the ridge and out of sight of the fort. Back at the stockade, the men waited and listened. The first sounds were the disciplined volleys of the soldiers' rifles. Then came a different sound, a chaotic, overwhelming roar of gunfire, screams, and war cries that washed over the hills. It was the sound of over 1,500 warriors rising from the ravines and tall grass, engulfing Fetterman's small command. The storm of noise raged for perhaps 20 minutes, and then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. An absolute, profound silence fell over the snow-covered landscape, a silence that was infinitely more terrifying than the battle itself. When a second relief party finally dared to venture out, they walked into a scene from a frozen nightmare. Fetterman's boast had been answered. He and his 80 men had ridden into the Sioux Nation, and not a single one had survived. The bodies were stripped and mutilated, frozen into grotesque poses in the bloody snow. This wasn't just a defeat. It was an obliteration. It was an announcement from the tribes that the fort was a cage, and everyone inside was marked for death. The affront wasn't an insult to one man's honor. It was a mortal blow to the entire community. The very possibility of survival had been extinguished. The fort was now a tomb, and the fuse that had been lit that morning had now reached the powder keg. Inside Fort Phil Kearny, a new kind of cold set in, one that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a cold dread that seeped into the bones of every man. The fort was no longer a bastion of the U.S. Army. It was a coffin with the lid closing. The men who had brought back the dead were now ghosts themselves, their faces hollow, their eyes staring at horrors they could not unsee. Every shadow on the stockade wall looked like a warrior poised to attack. The wind itself seemed to carry the mocking laughter of their victorious enemies. The path of compromise, of negotiation, of survival had been wiped off the map with Fetterman's command. Colonel Carrington was a man cornered by fate. He was an engineer, a builder, not a butcher. But he understood logistics, and the numbers were a death sentence. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest telegraph. They were dangerously low on ammunition, and there were thousands of warriors in the hills, flushed with the greatest victory they had ever won against the army. To wait was to die. To wait for a relief column that didn't even know they were in trouble was to slowly freeze and starve while their enemies decided the perfect moment to storm the walls and finish the job. There was only one option, a desperate, suicidal, single thread of hope. He had to get a message out. He gathered his officers first, then the enlisted men. He stood before them, not as a commander giving an order, but as a man pleading for the lives of their families. He laid out the situation with brutal honesty. He needed a volunteer a courier to ride 236 miles south to Fort Laramie. He didn't sugarcoat it. He was asking a man to ride into the heart of the storm through a gauntlet of death, with the fate of every soul in that fort resting on his shoulders. A heavy, profound silence answered him. The soldiers, the men who had sworn an oath to obey, looked at the floorboards, at the ceiling, anywhere but at their commander's face. This wasn't cowardice. It was a cold, rational assessment of the facts. They had all heard the battle. Many had seen the frozen, butchered bodies of their comrades. They knew the hills were alive with warriors who could see a puff of breath in the cold air from a mile away. On top of that, the sky was turning a heavy, bruised gray. A blizzard, a true Dakota whiteout, was descending. To ride out that gate was not a mission. It was a self-inflicted execution. Every man there knew it. The silence was their answer. No one moved. No one spoke. In that moment, the formal structure of the army dissolved, replaced by the simple, primal instinct to survive. The warnings weren't being ignored. They were being screamed by the wind and the snow and the memory of Fetterman's folly. And by refusing, the soldiers had unknowingly sealed the fort's fate. They had closed the final conventional door, leaving only one unconventional path. The situation had become so dire that only a man operating by a different, more personal code could even contemplate it. In the echoing silence of that room, John Phillips stood in the back, an observer. He was not a soldier. No oath bound him to this fort, to these men, or to their desperate cause. This was his final crossroads, his last and most perfect chance to choose life. All he had to do was nothing. All he had to do was stay quiet, just like every other man in uniform was doing. He could remain invisible, just another civilian contractor who rightly decided that this wasn't his fight. No one would have called him a coward. They would not have called him anything at all, because they would not have even noticed him. Imagine that moment of decision. The wind howls outside the walls, a physical reminder of the white death waiting in the darkness. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of lamp oil, damp wool, and fear. He sees the defeated look on Colonel Carrington's face. He sees the terror in the eyes of the young soldiers who had just seen their friends returned in pieces. His entire life, from the Azores to the goldfields, had been a masterclass in survival. Every instinct he had honed, every lesson learned the hard way, screamed at him to stay put, to blend in, to live to see another sunrise. The crossroads for John Phillips wasn't a choice between two paths on a map. It was a choice between two versions of himself. One was the survivor, the man who had cleverly navigated a hostile world and stayed alive against the odds. The other was the man whose word was his bond, whose integrity was the only thing he truly owned. To stay silent was to choose survival. It was the logical, sane, and easy choice. But for him, it would have been a kind of death in itself. It would mean that when the ultimate test came, his code, the very foundation of his character, had crumbled. And so, in the frozen silence, he made his choice. He rejected the peace of anonymity. He rejected the safety of inaction. He took a single step forward, and then another, the sound of his worn boots on the floorboards cutting through the tension. He walked past the silent soldiers, past the stunned officers, until he stood before his commander. He didn't make a speech. He didn't bargain or boast. In a quiet voice, thick with his foreign accent, he said he would go. In that moment, John Portugee Phillips consciously and deliberately chose the storm. He sealed his own fate, trading his life for his word. He didn't ride out the main gate like a hero. Heroes didn't leave Fort Phil Kearny that night. Only ghosts did. In the dead of night, under a sky choked with snow, John Phillips and Colonel Carrington's prized horse were lowered over the back of the stockade wall by a rope. When their feet touched the ground, the rope was pulled up, and the simple act of its disappearance was a final, silent severing. The world of men, of warmth and firelight, was gone. He was alone, outside the wire, a single, fragile life in a universe of white fury. The blizzard wasn't just weather, it was a physical assault. The wind hit him like a solid wall, stealing the air from his lungs. The snow wasn't falling, it was screaming past him, a horizontal torrent of ice needles that stung any exposed piece of skin. The world narrowed to the space between his horse's ears. He couldn't see the horizon, he couldn't see the mountains, he could barely see the ground beneath him. He was navigating through a churning white abyss, guided only by a frontiersman's instinct and the feel of the wind on his one good cheek. This was the heart of the storm, a place where time and distance lost all meaning. There was only the endless crunch of the horse's hooves in the deep snow, the shriek of the wind, and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He rode at night, hiding during the day in snow-choked gullies, chewing on a few hard biscuits that tasted like sawdust. He was a shadow moving through a landscape of shadows, and every twisted tree, every snowdrift could be an ambush. The distant cry of a wolf could just as easily be the signal of a warrior. He wasn't just fighting the cold, he was fighting the terror that the cold bred in his soul. The reckoning was a slow, creeping thing. It was the moment he realized the feeling in his toes was gone, not with a sharp pain, but with a quiet, fading into nothingness. It was when his eyelids kept freezing shut, and he had to pry them open with a numb, clumsy hand. The cold was a patient predator, and it began its grim work, stealing pieces of him one by one. The pain from his knees, rubbed raw and frozen against the saddle, became a distant, unimportant fact. He was moving past the point of simple suffering and into a state of pure, mechanical endurance. Beneath him, he could feel the great heart of the Kentucky thoroughbred laboring, a brave and steady rhythm against the chaos of the storm. The horse was his partner in this ordeal, his only living connection in this dead world. Its warmth was the only warmth he knew, its strength was his own. He pressed his face into its mane, the frozen hairs like wire against his skin, and drew what little comfort he could from its powerful living presence. The argument that had begun in the commander's office was now, finally, over. The choices had all been made. There was no turning back, no possibility of rescue, no option but to ride forward into the white darkness. The John Phillips who had been a woodcutter was gone, frozen somewhere back on the trail. The man who now rode through the blizzard was something harder, something stripped down to a single burning purpose. He was no longer a man on a horse. He was a message, being carried toward a destination, and nothing short of death itself was going to stop him. The end of the road came without ceremony, just miles from Fort Laramie. The Kentucky thoroughbred, the magnificent animal that had carried him through the frozen hell, took one more shuddering step and then simply collapsed into the snow. Its great heart, which had beaten in time with his own for 236 miles, had finally given out. For a moment, Phillips lay there, tangled with the dying horse, a man pinned beneath the weight of his own salvation. But the message he carried was a living thing, and it forced him to his feet. He was no longer a rider. He was a dead man, walking, stumbling through the deep drifts on feet he could no longer feel. As he drew closer, he began to hear it, a faint, alien sound drifting on the wind. It was music, laughter, the sounds of another world, a world of warmth and safety that he had almost forgotten existed. The lights of the fort were a hazy glow in the swirling snow, pulling him forward. His mind was a frozen fog. There was no triumph, no relief, only the cold, mechanical imperative to reach that light and deliver his message. His body was just a vessel, a shell of flesh and bone that had been pushed far beyond its limits, and it was beginning to crumble. He didn't knock. He burst through the doors of the officers' ball like an apparition, a specter from the brutal world they were all trying so desperately to forget. For a moment he just stood there, swaying on his feet, a creature of ice and frozen blood, his face blackened by frostbite. The music stopped. The laughter died in the throats of the partygoers. They stared in stunned silence, their civilized celebration shattered by the sudden arrival of the raw, frozen truth of the frontier. He staggered forward, his eyes locking on the commander. His mouth worked, but no sound came out at first. Then, with the last ounce of his will, he forced the words out. The voice was a dry, rasping thing, the sound of ice scraping on stone. He croaked out the news of the massacre, of the besieged fort, of the 81 dead men lying frozen in the snow. He delivered the message. The promise was kept. And with the duty done, the iron will that had held him together for 4 days finally snapped. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he pitched forward onto the floor, unconscious before he even hit the polished wood. The machine had finally shut down. His ride was over. The message John Phillips delivered was like a lightning strike in the dead of winter. It jolted Fort Laramie out of its holiday stupor and into a frantic state of action. Bugles blew, orders were shouted, and a powerful relief column was hastily assembled to march north. The news of the Fetterman disaster and the ride of Portugee Phillips began to spread like wildfire across the frontier. In one night, he had become a legend. But while the machinery of the army ground into motion to save the living, the man who set it all in motion was fighting a different kind of war, alone in a quiet room in the post infirmary. The wreckage of his ride wasn't left in the snow-choked canyons, it was written all over his own body. The army surgeons who worked on him were grim. The frostbite was severe, blackening his fingers, his nose, and his feet. They did what they could, but they knew he would be a cripple for the rest of his life, forever marked by those 4 days in the blizzard. The pain as his frozen flesh began to thaw was an agony worse than the cold itself. He had saved the community at Fort Phil Kearny, but in doing so, he had shattered himself. The cost was also measured in dollars and cents, a cruel insult added to a profound injury. He had been promised $300 for his service. But Colonel Carrington's horse, the noble animal that had died beneath him, was valued at far more than that. Phillips, out of his unwavering sense of honor, felt obligated to cover the cost. His ride into legend had, in a cold, hard ledger, put him in debt. He had traded his health and his future for the survival of others, and the immediate result was financial ruin. And what of the people he saved? Back at Fort Phil Kearny, they were trapped in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a death that seemed inevitable. Hope had withered with each passing day. Then, on the horizon, they saw it, the dark line of the relief column, a miracle marching through the snow. For the soldiers, the women, and the children of that besieged fort, John Phillips's ride was nothing less than an act of God. He had pulled them back from the brink of annihilation. This is the true, bitter cost of his legend. The ripple effect of his ride was a cruel paradox. For the community, it meant life, relief, and salvation. For the man himself, it was the beginning of a long, slow decline. The tragedy wasn't a single violent act that tore a family apart. It was a single, heroic act, and the wreckage it left behind was the slow, painful dismantling of the very man who had performed it. Every day of life granted to the people of Fort Phil Kearny was a day purchased with a piece of his own body and soul. Now, you might think the story ends there, with a hero being nursed back to health, celebrated by the men he saved. But John Phillips was about to face a new kind of enemy, one far more patient and unforgiving than any Lakota warrior. He was about to go up against the United States government and its endless grinding machinery of bureaucracy. His trial wouldn't take place in a courtroom with a judge and jury, but in the dusty backrooms of the War Department, and the verdict would be a slow death by 1,000 paper cuts. Here was the clash of two worlds, two entirely different codes. On the frontier, a man's word was his bond. A deal was struck with a handshake, and honor demanded it be kept. Phillips had made such a deal. He rode into hell on a promise. But he had stepped out of that world and into a world of ink and ledgers. In Washington, a man's word was worthless without a signature on the right form, filed in triplicate and approved by a committee that had never felt the sting of a blizzard. His simple, honest claim for the money he was owed, for the value of the horse he had lost, was met with a stone wall of paperwork. The community's verdict was swift and clear. Colonel Carrington, the man whose life and command Phillips had saved, championed his cause relentlessly. He wrote letters, filed reports, and testified to the incredible bravery of the civilian courier. Other officers and soldiers who were there that winter added their voices, telling anyone who would listen that this man was a hero of the highest order, and he was being wronged. To the people on the ground, the men who understood the stakes, Phillips was a martyr being punished by the very system he had preserved. But their voices grew faint as they traveled east. For years, John Phillips and his wife petitioned Congress for fair compensation. They sent letters, they filed claims, they begged. Each time, their request was lost in the bureaucratic maze. It was delayed, denied on a technicality, or simply ignored. To the politicians and clerks in their warm offices, he was not a hero. He was a number on a claim form, an accounting anomaly, an inconvenience. The brutal reality of his sacrifice was reduced to a few lines of dry text that could be easily dismissed. The final judgment, delivered not with a gavel, but with decades of institutional silence, was one of profound ingratitude. While he was eventually paid a small amount, he was never fully compensated for his losses, for his broken health, or for the horse that died beneath him. The law of the land, with all its procedures and protocols, had failed to recognize the simple honor of a man who kept his word. It was a cold, quiet lesson. In the eyes of the government, a hero's ride was just another line item in a budget, and true justice was a luxury the system could not afford. So what of the men who provoked this desperate ride? What became of the antagonists in this story? The first, Captain William Fetterman, the man whose arrogance lit the fuse, received his judgment swiftly and brutally. He and his 80 men met their justice on that frozen ridge, their foolish boasts silenced forever. His story is a simple, bloody, cautionary tale about pride, and his fate was sealed the moment he defied his orders. There is no ambiguity there, just the cold, hard consequence of a fatal flaw. But what of the other side of this bloody coin? What of Red Cloud, the brilliant Lakota strategist who orchestrated the entire trap? In the immediate aftermath, he was the victor, the undisputed master of his domain. The Fetterman fight was the greatest triumph of his life, a stunning blow that sent shockwaves through the United States Army. For a brief, glorious time, he had stopped the invasion of his lands. 2 years later, he would achieve the unthinkable. In the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the U.S. government agreed to abandon Fort Phil Kearny and the other posts on the Bozeman Trail. Red Cloud had won his war. But history is a long and cruel river. The victory was a flash of lightning in a gathering storm. The tide of settlers, soldiers, and gold miners was too powerful to hold back forever. Red Cloud, the great warrior who had defeated the U.S. Army on his own terms, would live to see his people's world shrink to the confines of a reservation. He would trade his war lance for the politician's pen, fighting a desperate, losing battle for his people's rights, with words and treaties instead of arrows and guns. He died an old man, long after the buffalo were gone, living in a wooden house, a respected but ultimately defeated leader. And so, the story has no clean villain. Red Cloud was not an evil man. He was a patriot defending his home, his family, and his way of life from an invader. His temporary triumph led to a lifetime of watching that way of life slowly die. The outcome wasn't neat or satisfying. It was a messy, tragic collision of two worlds, where the man who won the most famous battle ultimately lost the war. It serves as a haunting reminder that in the great grinding conflicts of history, there are rarely clear winners, only varying degrees of loss. John Phillips survived the ride, but the man who had ridden out of Fort Phil Kearny never truly came back. He tried to build a life on the far side of his legend. He married, he bought a small ranch, and he tried to become just another man working the land. But every morning when he woke, the ghost of that ride was there waiting for him. It lived in the ache of his bones, in the stiffness of his crippled feet, and in the constant gnawing pain that the doctors could do nothing about. His body was a map of that terrible journey, and it was a map he could never fold up and put away. And then came the final cruel twist of irony. Just 2 years after his ride, in 1868, the government signed a new treaty with Red Cloud. As part of the deal, the United States agreed to abandon Fort Phil Kearny completely. The soldiers packed up, the flag was lowered, and the gates were shut for the last time. The Lakota, in a final act of victory, burned the hated fort to the ground, erasing Fort Despair from the face of the earth. The community Phillips had nearly died to save was scattered to the winds, and the ground he had bought with his own flesh and blood was given back. You have to let that sink in. The place that had demanded the ultimate sacrifice was deemed strategically worthless just a short time later. The power in the region had shifted, not because of a single hero's ride, but because of the larger tides of war and politics. Phillips's act of incredible bravery had saved every soul inside that fort, but it had done nothing to change the final outcome of the war he'd stumbled into. It was a personal triumph inside a strategic defeat. The years that followed were a slow, painful decline. His health, shattered by the ordeal, never recovered. He was a young man in the body of a very old one. The ranch failed. He and his wife struggled, always living in the shadow of that one great, terrible moment. He died in 1883, just 17 years after his ride. He was only 51 years old. The ride had given him a legend, but it had taken the rest of his life as payment, a debt that came due in slow, painful installments over the years, leaving his family with the legacy of a quiet, broken hero whom the world had already begun to forget. If you go to Wyoming today, you can still find the ghosts of this story. You can stand on the windswept prairie where Fort Phil Kearny once stood. There's not much left to see. The wooden walls that held so much terror are gone, reduced to ash and then to dust. But the depressions in the earth are still there, a faint outline of the place, and if you stand on Lodge Trail Ridge when a winter wind is blowing, the past feels dangerously close. The land itself holds the memory. And if you travel south to Cheyenne, you can find his final resting place, a quiet stone slab in a cemetery bearing the name John Phillips. It's a simple, weathered piece of granite, the final, understated testament to an epic life. But the real echo of John Phillips isn't in stone or soil. It's in the story itself. His ride has been transformed over the decades from a historical event into a true piece of American folklore. It has become a campfire tale told by historical guides and local old-timers, a story that sends a shiver down your spine even on a warm day. The facts are there, but they've been polished by time into something more elemental, a legend about the limits of human endurance. The part of the story that truly lives, the image that has been burned into the memory of the West, is his arrival at the Christmas ball. Historians can argue about the details, but the legend doesn't care. The image of that frozen specter of a man bursting into the warmth and light, bringing the cold, hard truth of the frontier crashing into their celebration, that is the heart of the ballad. It's a perfect, haunting scene that captures the entire brutal contrast of life and death on the edge of the world. So while John Phillips, the man, is long gone, his spirit still haunts those high plains. It's not the ghost of a dead man, but the ghost of a certain kind of character, the quiet outsider, the man who doesn't talk but does, the one who steps forward when everyone else steps back. His name is an echo on the wind, a reminder that the West wasn't built by famous generals or charismatic leaders alone. It was built on the backs of forgotten men like him, men who rode into the heart of the storm, fueled by nothing more than a stubborn sense of duty and a promise they refused to break. So we come back to the question that hung in the air of that Christmas ball, the one we asked at the very beginning: was John Phillips a hero, or was he a fool? The truth is, he was neither, and he was both. A fool would have died in the first 10 miles. A conventional hero acts for glory, for country, for a cause greater than himself. But Phillips' ride feels different, more personal, more elemental. He wasn't riding for a flag. He was riding to honor a contract he had made with himself. In a world where his accent marked him as other, his word was the one piece of ground he truly owned, and he would not surrender it, not even to a blizzard that could freeze the sun. In the end, this is a story about the terrible, beautiful price of integrity. It's a lesson in how a man's greatest strength, his absolute refusal to break a promise, can become the very thing that breaks him. He faced 2 storms on that ride, the storm of snow and wind, and the storm of human chaos and violence. He conquered them both. But then he ran headlong into the cold, slow, indifferent glacier of bureaucracy, and it ground him down. His story is a testament to the fact that the most profound acts of courage are often quiet, unrewarded, and performed not for the applause of the world, but for the quiet satisfaction of a man who needs to be able to look himself in the mirror. John Phillips was the quiet man from a distant shore, the one they called Portugee, who started with nothing and had only his reputation to his name. When the moment of absolute crisis came, when the soldiers and professionals all deemed the task impossible, it was the outsider who stepped forward to do the job. He saved them all, and in return, the world forgot him. And that, my friends, is the Ballad of John Phillips, the man who rode into the heart of a storm to prove that a promise, even when it costs you everything you have, is the only thing worth holding on to.